White terrorism refers to acts of violence, intimidation, or terrorism committed by individuals or groups who identify as white and espouse white supremacist ideologies. It involves the use of violence or the threat of violence to advance a white supremacist agenda, or to target individuals or communities based on their race, ethnicity, religion, or other factors. White terrorism encompasses a range of actions, from hate crimes and acts of domestic terrorism to organized extremist movements. These acts often aim to instill fear, spread a message of racial superiority, and further the goals of white supremacist ideology. Perpetrators of white terrorism may target minority groups, religious minorities, immigrants, or individuals advocating for social justice and equality. Examples of white terrorism include the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing committed by Timothy McVeigh, the 2015 Charleston church shooting carried out by Dylan Roof, and the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand by Brenton Tarrant. These incidents highlight the destructive and deadly consequences of white supremacist ideologies and their potential to incite violence and terror. It's important to note that white terrorism is not representative of the beliefs or actions of all individuals who identify as white. It refers specifically to those who engage in acts of violence or terrorism in the name of white supremacy. It is a term used to describe a subset of extremist ideologies and actions that pose a threat to societal harmony and the safety of targeted communities. The roots of white terrorism can be traced back to various historical contexts and ideologies. It emerged as a product of racial hierarchies, colonialism, and supremacist ideologies. While it is difficult to pinpoint a single origin or individual responsible for starting white terrorism, we can identify several contributing factors. Historical racism. White terrorism is deeply intertwined with the history of racism and the development of racial hierarchies. Throughout history, societies have been structured based on notions of racial superiority, with white populations often asserting dominance over others. This sense of superiority has fueled violence and terrorism against marginalized communities. White supremacist ideologies. White terrorism often finds its roots in white supremacist ideologies, which assert the superiority of the white race and advocate for the preservation of racial purity. These ideologies can be traced back to movements such as white nationalism, white separatism, and white power movements, which have existed for centuries. Reconstruction era and Jim Crow. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan emerged as a response to efforts to grant rights and opportunities to newly freed African Americans. These groups engaged in acts of terrorism, violence, and intimidation to suppress black political power and maintain racial subjugation. Nazi Germany and European fascism. White terrorism also has connections to the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly during the 20th century. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime's ideology of Aryan racial supremacy contributed to the spread of white supremacist ideologies worldwide, including in the United States. Online radicalization. In recent years, the internet and social media platforms have played a significant role in the dissemination and radicalization of individuals into white supremacist ideologies. Online spaces have provided platforms for recruitment, organizing, and the spread of hateful ideologies, amplifying the reach and impact of white terrorism. It is important to recognize that white terrorism is a complex and evolving phenomenon influenced by a range of historical, social, and ideological factors. It continues to pose a significant threat to marginalized communities and requires ongoing efforts to combat extremism, promote inclusivity, and address systemic racism. White terrorism has profound and far-reaching effects on Black Americans and their communities. Here are some ways in which white terrorism harms Black Americans. Physical harm and loss of life. Acts of white terrorism, such as hate crimes and acts of domestic terrorism, can result in physical harm and loss of life within Black communities. These violent acts target individuals based on their race, ethnicity, or religious background, instilling fear and creating an environment of insecurity. Trauma and psychological impact. White terrorism creates a climate of fear and anxiety within Black communities. The repeated exposure to acts of violence and the constant threat of terrorism can lead to long-lasting trauma and psychological distress among individuals and communities. It undermines their sense of safety, well-being, and psychological resilience. Community disruption. White terrorism disrupts the social fabric and cohesion of Black communities. It creates divisions, erodes trust, and instills a sense of vulnerability. Communities may become more isolated, limiting social interactions and impeding collective progress and unity. Economic consequences. Acts of white terrorism can have significant economic consequences for Black Americans and their communities. Businesses may be targeted, leading to financial losses and the disruption of local economies. Fear of violence and instability can also deter investments and economic development, perpetuating socio-economic disparities. Hindrance to progress and equality. White terrorism undermines efforts towards racial progress and equality. It creates a hostile environment that hinders the pursuit of social justice and the dismantling of systemic racism. The fear and trauma inflicted by white terrorism can impede the advancement of educational, economic, and political opportunities for Black Americans. Intimidation and suppression of activism. White terrorism aims to intimidate and silence individuals advocating for racial justice and equality. Activists and community leaders may face threats, harassment, and violence, creating barriers to their work and discouraging others from speaking out against systemic racism. Intergenerational impact. The effects of white terrorism can be intergenerational as trauma, fear, and distrust can be passed down through families and communities. The historical trauma inflicted by white terrorism can shape collective memory and impact future generations' well-being, perpetuating cycles of disadvantage. It is crucial to recognize the harms inflicted by white terrorism on Black Americans and work towards dismantling systems of oppression, promoting racial justice, and ensuring the safety and well-being of marginalized communities. Stopping white terrorism requires a comprehensive and multifaceted approach involving various stakeholders. Here are some strategies that can contribute to addressing and mitigating white terrorism. Law enforcement and intelligence. Effective law enforcement efforts are crucial in identifying, investigating, and preventing acts of white terrorism. Agencies should allocate resources to monitor and track extremist activities, disrupt terrorist networks, and apprehend individuals involved in planning or carrying out attacks. Collaboration between law enforcement agencies and intelligence services is essential to gather information and respond effectively to potential threats. Counterterrorism policies and legislation. Governments can enact legislation specifically targeting white terrorism and hate crimes, providing law enforcement agencies with the necessary tools to investigate and prosecute such acts. Policies should focus on dismantling extremist networks, disrupting radicalization processes, and countering hate speech and propaganda that fuel white supremacist ideologies. Education and awareness. Promoting education and awareness about the dangers of white terrorism, racism, and the historical context that fuels these ideologies is critical. Educational institutions and community organizations should incorporate curricula that address the history of racism and encourage critical thinking to challenge discriminatory beliefs. Raising public awareness through campaigns, workshops, and discussions can foster a more inclusive and tolerant society. Community engagement and support. Building strong relationships between law enforcement agencies and communities affected by white terrorism is essential. Engaging with local communities, listening to their concerns, and providing resources for reporting suspicious activities can help foster trust and encourage cooperation in preventing acts of violence. Community-led initiatives and grassroots organizations can play a significant role in countering extremist ideologies and promoting social cohesion. Online platform accountability, social media platforms, and online spaces play a significant role in the radicalization and recruitment of individuals into white supremacist ideologies. Stricter regulation and accountability measures can help curb the spread of extremist content, hate speech, and recruitment efforts. Cooperation between tech companies, governments, and civil society organizations is vital in monitoring and taking action against online platforms that facilitate white terrorism. Addressing root causes, addressing the underlying factors that contribute to white terrorism is crucial. This includes addressing systemic racism, social and economic inequalities, and promoting social justice initiatives. By tackling these root causes, societies can work towards creating an inclusive and equitable environment that is less conducive to the growth of extremist ideologies. It's important to note that no single approach can completely eliminate white terrorism. A comprehensive strategy that combines law enforcement efforts, community engagement, education, and addressing root causes is necessary. Continual evaluation, collaboration, and adaptation of strategies based on evolving threats are essential to effectively combat white terrorism and promote a more just and inclusive society.